Numerous tales surround my own beginnings, and this day I'll recount a few for you. Certain names remain eternal, my cherished companion, particularly those inscribed in crimson upon history's leaves. Have you ever pondered how a mere fable from the Carpathians took over the globe? How a little-known prince of Wallachia became the eternal count that has troubled our dreams for more than 100 years? Step into the shadowy excavation of the greatest vampire ever conceived, a being spawned not only from Bram Stoker's mind, but from the abyss of European chronicles, olden mythology, and mankind's deepest terrors. I am Obsidian Vault, leading you through history's darkness, where legend merges with truth as if they were lovers clandestine. This evening, we journey downward into the abandoned vaults, housing the genuine beginnings of Count Dracula, that noble of darkness, whose influence surpasses novels, to embody an everlasting icon of dread. Starting from the untamed peaks of Transylvania to the gore-drenched courts of the Ottoman realm, from the dusty archives of Dublin to the fog-veiled fortresses of the Carpathians, we shall examine the 7 masks of the Lord of Shadows, beasts and mortals who collectively shaped the most renowned vampire in history, an entity whose reach goes beyond Gothic fright, covering the entire circle of Western civilization. Subscribe to embark with us on a journey through the dark side of history, and leave a comment telling which of Dracula's origins most frightened your soul. At this moment, when the darkness deepens and the sun disappears, let me tell the authentic history hidden behind the immortal myth. First source, Vlad the Impaler. In the winter of 1431, at a time when Europe was still bleeding from the 100 Years' War, a prince was born in the fortress of Sighisoara, whose name was to be recorded not by a pen, but by the blood of his enemies. Voivode Vlad III of Wallachia, known to descendants as Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, and to his own generation as Dracula, the offspring of the dragon. Imagine, please, the folded peaks of medieval Transylvania, as stone fortresses jut out like shattered fangs against the pale sky. In this place, on the blood-soaked border between Christendom and the Ottoman Empire, Vlad, from a young age, understood that salvation often required cruelty. As a descendant of Vlad II Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian knightly brotherhood fighting the Ottoman Turks, young Vlad inherited not only his father's name, but also his iron will to defend his country from invasion. But it was precisely the period he spent as a political prisoner at the Ottoman court that shaped the character of the future Impaler. Detained together with his younger sibling Radu by Sultan Murad II, Vlad saw directly the savage machinations of empire. As his brother accepted Ottoman ways and changed his faith to Islam, gaining the title Radu the Handsome, Vlad became full of rancor and spite. His loathing for the Turks and his brother alike smoldered until his last breath. Upon finally ascending to the throne in 1456, Vlad discovered Wallachia broken by noble uprisings and menaced by Ottoman growth. His reaction was immediate and pitiless. "The land is ruined," he announced to his council. "The magnates turn against their rulers, and the populace endures. I will bring back order by any methods required." That approach carved his identity into the most sinister chapters of time. His favored execution technique, the stake, became his hallmark. Sufferers were impaled upon pointed logs pushed through their frames, placed precisely to miss critical parts, guaranteeing a long, torturous demise prolonged over many days. The poles were then erected upright, forming woodlands of the perishing that instilled horror in his foes. Records from that time mention an especially dreadful scene in the year 1462. This happened when Ottoman ruler Mehmed II, commanding a force exceeding 90,000 soldiers, neared Targovishte, the Wallachian seat of power. What he discovered has tormented the European imagination ever since. An entire woodland of around 20,000 Turkish captives, each impaled, was laid out in concentric rings beyond the city walls. The effect on morale was utterly crushing. Mehmed, a warrior who had captured Constantinople, was not enough to keep his forces from retreating. He is said to have asked, "How can we oppose one who performs such horrific and inhuman deeds?" "I have slain both men and women, the elderly and the young," Vlad confessed in a letter to the Hungarian monarch Matthias Corvinus. At Oblucida, I butchered countless peasants. I burned young ones alive and forced their mothers to eat them. This is the manner in which I defend my land. However, for the Romanian populace, Vlad was not simply a fiend. He was a severe guardian. Narratives of his savage judgments are tempered by accounts of his even-handedness. One story says Vlad set a goblet of gold on a town well, free for anyone to use. Throughout his rule, no one dared take it. So profound was the dread generated by his penalties. He battled dishonesty among the aristocratic boyars, shielded Romanian traitors, and used sheer intimidation to halt Ottoman encroachment. Vlad held power only a short time, 6 years, all told, spread over 3 separate reigns, yet his historical resonance proved timeless. He fell in battle against the Ottomans in 1476, a demise as brutal as the life he had led. Certain records say he was decapitated, his skull kept in honey, and dispatched to Constantinople to confirm his death. Alternate versions propose interment at the Snagov Island monastery. Yet when the grave was unearthed in the 20th century, it lay utterly vacant. In 1890, while conducting research at the Whitby Library, Bram Stoker stumbled upon the title Dracula. It proved far more than a mere historical aside. He uncovered an instant antagonist whose brutality and peculiar magnetism aligned flawlessly with the dark narrative he was weaving. Stoker's vampire lord differs greatly in appearance from the real Vlad, who period writings depict with a long beard and black hair, unlike the pale, noble image in the novel. Yet the mental image of a pitiless, shrewd hunter carried over flawlessly. The blood is the life, Stoker's count declares, mirroring the genuine Vlad's clear thirst for blood. But whereas the imaginary count consumes blood to survive, the actual Dracula appeared to shed it purely to breed fear. Nevertheless, both considered brutality an instrument of authority, a resource used without guilt. The reason Vlad Tepes proves so fascinating as a foundation for vampire mythology is not just his savagery, but the paradox at the core of his heritage. For Romanians, he persists as a national hero, his deeds validated by the mortal dangers that confronted his country. In the eyes of Western Europeans, he transformed into a terrifying specter, the focus of some of the first terror leaflets spread across Germany and Russia, adorned with carvings showing his monstrous acts. In the woodlands of Romania, as dusk falls and shadows stretch over the peaks, residents still mention Vlad with a blend of honor and discomfort. He carried out what had to be done, they whisper while making the sign of the cross. Yet only the Almighty truly knows the evil that dwelled within his soul. Second origin, Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. As Vlad Tepes reigned through fear in Wallachia, another aristocrat, born 100 years afterwards, would exceed even his appetite for blood, claiming the rank of the most deadly female murderer in history, adding a key component to the Dracula legend, the link between blood and everlasting youth. In the cold season of 1560, while Renaissance enlightenment glowed over Western Europe, but kept its eastern borders in medieval darkness, Elizabeth Báthory was birthed into Hungarian aristocracy within the Kingdom of Hungary, now modern-day Slovakia. Her lineage ranked among the most influential in Central Europe. The Báthory clan had given rise to monarchs, dukes, and church cardinals. Elizabeth received an extraordinary education for a lady of her era. She was fluent in multiple tongues, among them Greek and Latin, and was taught science and mathematics. Yet the Báthory family concealed a sinister side. The Báthory bloodline carried epilepsy, alongside whispers of insanity. Her aunt introduced her to devil worship, and her uncle educated her in the ways of sadomasochism. Brutality and ruthlessness were interwoven into the very structure of her luxurious upbringing. Elizabeth wed Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a famous military leader, when she was just 15. As Ferenc battled the Ottoman Turks, Elizabeth oversaw their expansive lands, including the formidable Chaktice Castle. Its thick stone walls and remote position in the Carpathian Mountains made it a place of isolation. Within these secluded walls, Elizabeth's cruel impulses would grow into unspeakable atrocities. At first, the Countess's harsh treatment of maids was written off as typical noble discipline. For petty offenses, She would drive pins beneath their nails or sear their skin with red-hot irons. After her husband died in 1604, Elizabeth's actions turned far more extreme. Based on accounts gathered from more than 300 witnesses, she started kidnapping young women from local villages, tricking them with false job offers. The fate that lay in store for them defied the worst nightmares. 4 devoted aides helped the Countess: the sorceress Dorota Sentes, the laundress Ilona Jo, the male servant Janos Ujvari, and the nurse Helena Jo. They carried out intricate tortures on these young victims, and the victims were stripped and beaten till their flesh turned black and swollen. Some were coated with honey and then abandoned outdoors to be consumed by bugs. Others were made to stand completely naked in icy water until hypothermia killed them. Young women were pierced with needles, their bodies sliced with shears, or their mouths ripped apart. The prettiest captives were confined in cramped cages where they could not stand, handled like beasts, and given morsels of their own meat to eat. Yet blood grew to be the Countess's fixation. The most notorious tale says that Elizabeth hit a maid who inadvertently yanked her hair during grooming. As the servant's blood spattered onto Elizabeth's hand, the Countess was convinced the spot where the blood landed on her skin appeared younger and smoother. And so started the practice that would make her infamous forever. Elizabeth immersed herself in the blood of young virgin women, believing this would keep her fabled beauty intact. Maids reported witnessing girls hung head downward, their necks cut open, so that the blood flowed into basins beneath, where the Countess would bathe. When a full bath was not possible, she would have blood delivered. Ornate golden containers with compartments were pressed to her face and skin as a grotesque beauty treatment. Elizabeth declared to her co-conspirators, "I will stay young and lovely. Death might seize everyone else, but it will never steal my beauty." For many years, missing persons reports were ignored because the Countess wielded immense influence. Village clergy who denied Christian burial rites to the mutilated corpses discovered near the castle were quieted with payoffs or intimidation. But eventually, Elizabeth committed a fatal error, and she started going after daughters of minor aristocrats, convinced their blood was more powerful than commoners. In the year 1610, Hungary's King Matthias II, finally reacting to the growing protests, commanded Elizabeth's relative, Count György Thurzo, to probe the matter. What Thurzo uncovered at Chachtice Castle on the 30th of December 1610 stunned even this seasoned politician. In his report, he stated that he came across one deceased young woman in the Great Hall, another near death, and numerous others locked away. Some showed injuries, others were emaciated and feeble. The proof was irrefutable, and Elizabeth Báthory and her helpers were taken into custody at once. The Countess's aides faced trial, found guilty of sorcery and homicide, and were put to death in horrific public spectacles. Dorota and Ilona suffered the removal of their nails and were cast into flames while still alive. Janos, who had aided in the killings, was decapitated, but Elizabeth never faced a courtroom. Her aristocratic rank shielded her from a public trial that could have shamed other noble houses. Rather, she was bricked into a series of chambers inside her own castle. All windows and entrances were sealed with bricks, leaving only narrow gaps for air and food to pass through. She stayed there for 4 years, right up until her demise in 1614, without ever showing regret for what she had done. The exact number of victims of Elizabeth Báthory's cruelty is still a matter of debate. The lowest estimates claim around 80 victims, but other sources argue that as many as 650 young women perished because of her. That count would crown her as the deadliest female serial killer ever known. There's no denying the impact the Blood Countess has left on vampire myths. The brutal link she forged between blood and eternal youth turned into a fundamental element of vampiric tradition. Even though Bram Stoker never directly named Elizabeth as the source for Dracula, his thorough investigation of Central European legends and history surely would have guided him to her tale. In Stoker's work, the Count's renewed vigor after consuming blood mirrors Elizabeth's violent quest for youth. "My revenge has just begun," Dracula proclaims. "I have centuries to carry it out, and time itself is my ally." Much like Elizabeth, his noble rank gives him authority and solitude, letting monstrous cravings intensify without restraint, hidden inside castle ramparts. Nowadays, Elizabeth Báthory endures as a grim echo of vampire folklore, not a supernatural fiend, but something possibly even more horrifying. She was a mortal who, empowered by riches and influence, saw others only as containers for fulfilling her own wishes. The fortress at Cactus lies in decay, where visitors experience a coldness unrelated to the mountain breeze. According to local folklore, when the moon is absent, the walls of Cactus still ooze blood. The screams of maidens reverberate throughout the surrounding valleys. Legend has it that Elizabeth's spirit haunts the broken walls, eternally lovely, endlessly hunting fresh prey to quench her unending thirst for vitality. The blood is the life, penned Stoker. Elizabeth Báthory embraced that idea with a faith far deeper than simple superstition, leaving behind a heritage of terror that still molds our most frightening stories centuries beyond her passing. Chapter 3. Varcolac and Strigoi, Romania's indigenous bloodsuckers. Ages before Bram Stoker wrote the opening lines of his timeless book, the foggy peaks and thick woodlands of Romania had already harbored night beings. They consumed blood and defied the stillness of the grave. These mythical vampires, the Varcolac and Strigoi, form the primordial ground from which the fictional Count Dracula would later emerge. Imagine, if you can, a secluded Romanian settlement back in the 1600s, and winter arrives prematurely, and night dominates 16 hours out of every day. Wolf calls resonate from the encircling woods, their sounds bouncing over snow-blanketed ravines. Inside a modest home, the local folk huddle near a hearth, their features lit by dancing firelight, while an old woman narrates stories of the undead that have plagued this region for ages beyond memory. The Varcolac, she murmurs, her twisted fingers drawing protective symbols in the air, is part wolf and part spirit, alive yet dead. Whenever the moon vanishes from the sky, it's because the Varcolac has eaten it, gulping down its brightness to fuel its twisted appetite. And the Varcolac holds a peculiar role in Romanian myth. At times, it is portrayed as a beast, similar to a werewolf, other times as a vampiric being that assaults heavenly objects instead of people. Old traditions say these entities are the tormented spirits of unbaptized infants or those morally tainted. After dying, they obtain the power to abandon their physical forms and ascend as phantom wolves, devouring the moon and stars. Whenever a crimson shade passes over the moon, the village elders caution, the Varcolac is having its feast. Keep to your homes and safeguard your kids, because once it has savored heavenly radiance, it will next crave the gleam in youthful gazes. Far more crucial to Stoker's figure, however, was the Strigoi, the genuine vampire of Romanian tradition. Contrary to the noble, charming count in fiction, the Strigoi was a common revenant. It was usually a villager who recently died and rose from the tomb to sap vitality from relatives and acquaintances. Certain signs identify people who are destined to turn into Strigoi after their demise, goes on our local narrator. She lowers her voice to a hush, as if these beings themselves could be eavesdropping. An infant born with a membrane covering its face, or with an extra digit. Individuals born outside marriage, or who experienced an unkind death. People who were cursed, or whose funeral ceremonies weren't conducted correctly. Any of them could come back on the 7th evening after being interred. The ways to recognize a Strigoi were as diverse as the many communities spread throughout the Carpathians. Some thought that a torn spot in the death shroud, gnawed by the corpse itself, proved vampirism. Others asserted that if a horse would not walk across a grave, it detected a sacrilegious force underground, and in some areas, suspicious burials were dug up. If the dead body displayed swelling, noticeable lengthening of hair or fingernails, or traces of blood near the mouth, the identification was verified. The actions of the Strigoi blended the material with the mystical. According to belief, they left their tombs after dark, shape-shifting into creatures or even staying unseen. They slipped into houses to press down on the chests of those asleep, triggering nightmares and gradually sapping their energy. A few reports mention them consuming blood straight from the source. Other theories proposed they consumed a subtler life force. Equally intriguing were the intricate measures Romanians employed to keep the dead from turning into Strigoi. Corpses were sometimes interred face downward, so they could not locate their path back from the tomb. Arranging wild roses, garlic, or wooden stakes inside or encircling the casket acted as defenses against revival. In dire situations, a stake was hammered into the body, not into the heart, as contemporary tales claim, but through the navel, securing the corpse to the ground. Dealing with those already resurrected involved horrendous rituals. A likely strigoi was dug up, its heart removed and incinerated, the residue blended with water and consumed by relatives. Other times, the head was chopped off and positioned beneath the feet or between the legs. At times, the corpse was reinterred at a crossroads, disorienting the undead if it attempted to return. What is particularly captivating is how such superstitions mirrored the difficult existence in medieval and early modern Romania. The signs blamed on vampire assaults, fatigue, paleness, night terrors, emaciation echo those of tuberculosis, anemia, and other prevalent ailments of the period. The strigoi offered a rationale for misfortune in societies with scarce medical understanding. Likewise, the bodily indicators of vampirism discovered upon exhumation, such as swelling, oral discharge, seeming extension of hair and nails, are currently identified as ordinary decay. However, for villagers observing these occurrences, paranormal interpretations appeared perfectly logical. As Bram Stoker commenced his inquiry into Transylvanian folklore at the British Museum, he came across scholarly texts that meticulously outlined these convictions. Emily Gerard's piece titled Transylvanian Superstitions and William Wilkinson's An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia furnished Stoker with genuine specifics that he integrated into his book. The novelist appropriated many aspects from Romanian folklore: the vampire's repulsion to garlic and crucifixes, the employment of holy items for defense, the significance of appropriate interment, and the techniques for annihilating the undead. Stoker refashioned the rustic strigoi into a nobleman, infused Victorian sensuality and colonial fears, yet the Romanian foundation stayed plainly obvious under his creative changes. The character of Count Dracula recognizes this heritage himself, proclaiming, "We Secules have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship." This allusion to the Sakely population of Transylvania ties the imaginary count to the authentic folklore of that territory. Even now, in isolated Romanian hamlets, these age-old convictions have not completely vanished. In 2004, within the locality of Maritanul de Sus, kin of a departed man called Toma Petre exhumed his remains 6 weeks post-internment. They extracted his heart, incinerated it, and stirred the dust into water for relatives to ingest. They believed he had transformed into a strigoi, pointing to odd sounds and an impression of an entity inside their dwellings. The endurance of vampire folklore into contemporary times reveals the potent psychological role these legends fulfill. The strigoi and varkolac supplied rationales for calamity, structures for grasping mortality, and methods for handling bereavement. They converted the disorganized dread of dying into coherent stories that societies could confront together. Meanwhile, in our envisioned scenario, the villagers attend to the elders' tales, and outside the wind wails, twigs scraping against timber planks like fingers of bone. They huddle tighter, bound against the gloom by mutual faith, because within these narratives resides not merely folklore, but a deep insight into humanity. Our compulsion to mold our anxieties, to reshape the unfathomable emptiness of death into something concrete that can be battled, comprehended, and eventually endured. The strigoi and verkolac might be beings of darkness and dread, yet they fulfilled an authentic function in the societies that dreaded them. They represent Romania's primordial vampires, preceding Bram Stoker's noblemen by ages, unifying groups through common fright and communal safeguarding rites. When Dracula declares to Jonathan Harker, "The blood is the life," he repeats convictions that fortified Romanian peasants through ages of adversity, articulating primordial anxieties that yet murmur across the hazy gorges of the Carpathians. The fourth source, Lord Byron and the Villa Diodati, the literary vampire. During a tempestuous evening in June 1816, inside an opulent mansion with a view of Lake Geneva, the contemporary literary vampire emerged. Its birthplace was not Romania or Hungary, but Switzerland, amid a compact assembly of British literary luminaries whose imaginative fervor would permanently alter our conception of the undead. The year 1816 is historically recorded as the year lacking a summer. The explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia propelled immense quantities of volcanic debris into the air, leading to a worldwide temperature decline that resulted in harvest collapses, starvation, and doomsday-like heavens over Europe and North America. Set against this canvas of abnormal gloom, a modest gathering of English émigrés assembled at the Villa Diodati. There they would forge creatures as lasting as the bizarre climate that kept them confined within. Lord Byron, already equally renowned and notorious, celebrated for the poet, notorious for his sexuality and indulgences, had leased the villa for the season. Accompanying him was his private doctor, Dr. John Polidori, a youthful individual harboring literary aspirations of his own. They were later accompanied by the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, his paramour Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, and Mary's half-sibling Claire Claremont, who was expecting Byron's offspring. Byron suggested one evening that each of them should compose a ghost story, while rain battered the windows and flashes of lightning revealed the lake beneath. This idea arose after the group had spent time reading German tales of apparitions out loud and debating the newest scientific concepts surrounding galvanism, the reanimation of lifeless flesh via electric current. From this daunting task, Mary would go on to produce Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, arguably the most renowned outcome of that tempestuous evening. Yet for our story, it is Dr. Polidori's work that holds our attention, most profoundly because he would sow the seed that eventually blossomed into the noble vampire we know today. Polidori's connection with Byron was intricate. Employed as the poet's traveling companion and personal doctor, the young physician felt both reverence and resentment toward his master. Byron embodied everything Polidori longed to become accomplished, magnetic, coveted. Yet the poet frequently dealt with his physician with offhand disdain, ridiculing his writing attempts and making him the target of pranks. In this environment of artistic strain that Polidori started writing The Vampire, a brief tale centered on Lord Ruthven, an elite undead hunter, unmistakably patterned after Byron himself. Inside Polidori's narrative, Ruthven appears as an aristocrat with enigmatic roots, who beguiles and ruins anyone who puts faith in him, scattering a wake of broken ladies and forsaken companions over the continent. His eccentricities made him welcome in every household. Everyone longed to meet him. Polidori penned about his vampire, a portrayal that just as fittingly described Byron. Although more than one person found themselves forced to pay a heavy price for this, few recognized the truth until loss had matured them, and dread was limited to those who had already, to some extent, become casualties. That tale stayed incomplete during that summer at Villa Diodati, yet in 1819 it appeared in the New Monthly magazine, mistakenly credited to Byron himself. This piece created a stir, emerging as the first major vampire narrative in English letters, and laying down components of vampire legend that Stoker would eventually weave into Dracula. Polidori's undead creature, Lord Ruthven, was not a common corpse emerging from its burial cloth. He was refined, noble, alluring, gliding among the elite with a hunter's elegance, choosing his prey from the attractive and powerful. His pallor came not from death, but from a delicate sensibility, his charisma concealing a frigid, scheming essence. It was as though the daylight gave him an even more spectral complexion, or that some quality within him turned him paler under the sun's rays. Polidori recorded, fixing the vampire's hatred of sunlight that later became standard lore. Via Lord Ruthven, Polidori morphed the vampire from a thoughtless cadaver into a cunning hunter, possessing psychological complexity. His undead figure served as a metaphor for the leeching upper class, sucking the vital essence of civilization while giving nothing back, a sharp indictment likely directed at Byron and his social circle. Byron himself had added to vampire mythology before that pivotal summer. Within his 1,813 lengthy poem The Giaour, he inserted what is deemed the earliest important mention of vampires in English writing. But first, on earth as vampire sent, thy corpse shall from its grave be rent. Then horribly haunt your homeland, and drink the blood of every member of your family. There from your daughter, sister, wife, At midnight drain the river of life, yet despise the feast that must nourish your pallid living corpse. These verses, stressing the bonds of family and nocturnal feeding, foreshadow aspects of Stoker's Dracula, Byron's intrigue regarding Eastern European legends. The observations he gathered during his travels provided authentic details that eventually became part of vampire literature. The publication of The Vampire sparked a vampire craze throughout Europe. This story was adapted into a stage play and performed in France and England. It also inspired further literary works, including James Malcolm Rymer's Times, Varney the Vampire Times, and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Times Carmilla. Stoker was likely familiar with both works. By the 1890s, when Bram Stoker began writing Times Dracula, the vampire in literature had evolved considerably from folklore. Polidori and his successors shaped a complex monster that retained human intelligence and moved through human society. Stoker's genius lay in combining these literary innovations with genuine folklore and historical elements. His Count Dracula merged the aristocratic menace of Lord Ruthven, the supernatural power of the Strigoi, the historical cruelty of Vlad Tepes, and the sexual undertones of Carmilla. The result was a vampire more complete and complex than any before. Dr. Polidori met a tragic end, committing suicide in 1821 at the age of 25. Byron died 3 years later in Greece. Neither lived to see how they had forever changed popular culture. Villa Diodati still stands today, overlooking the waters of Lake Geneva. Visitors say that a strange atmosphere lingers in the rooms where those literary giants once gathered. It is as if the creativity of that year without a summer still haunts the walls. John Keats wrote in his poem Times La Belle Dame Sans Merci, "I saw pale kings and princes too." The poem was published shortly after that fateful gathering. Pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, "La Belle Dame Sans Merci hath thee in thrall." Those pale kings of vampire literature, born in that storm-battered villa, still hold us in thrall. From a doctor's resentment toward his charismatic employer arose the modern vampire archetype, aristocratic, alluring, and psychologically complex, making him not merely a monster, but a dark mirror reflecting humanity's own predatory nature. Origin 5. Lilith, from Jewish mythology, the mother of vampires. Long before Vlad impaled his enemies or Elizabeth bathed in blood, an ancient Mesopotamian demon queen spread her wings across the night sky, seeking children to devour and men to seduce. Her name was Lilith, likely the original template for all later vampire entities. Lilith's origins trace back to Sumerian mythology around 4000 BCE, where she appeared as a wind spirit, but her evolution in Jewish folklore most directly connects her to vampire legends. In these traditions, Lilith was Adam's first wife, created from the same earth as him, his equal. According to the medieval Times Alphabet of Ben Sira, when Adam demanded that Lilith lie beneath him during intercourse, she refused. "We are equal, for we are both from the earth." When Adam insisted on dominance, Lilith spoke the ineffable name of God, grew wings, and flew away from Eden. God sent 3 angels to bring her back. They found Lilith near the Red Sea, consorting with demons. The angels demanded her return and threatened to kill 100 of her children each day. Lilith responded with defiance. She would rather pay that price than return in submission. Instead, she vowed revenge, to attack human infants, especially male infants in their first week and female infants in their first 3 weeks. However, she made a concession. Any house protected by an amulet inscribed with the names of the 3 angels would be spared her wrath. Thus began the tradition of protective amulets. Lilith's transformation from a rebellious first woman into a vampire entity was gradual, shaped by rabbinic interpretations and folk beliefs. The figure became a night demon preying on sleepers, especially solitary men, seducing them in dreams and draining their vitality. This aspect of her myth directly connects to the medieval European concept of the incubus, a female-form demon that drains men's life force through sexual intercourse. Ancient Hebrew scriptures warned, "Beware of the Lilim of the night, Lilith's demon offspring. They have women's faces but the wings of scavenger birds. Their touch brings fever, their kiss is death." As medieval Jewish folklore developed, Lilith's features grew increasingly vampiric. She was depicted with disheveled long hair and a pale complexion, with an insatiable thirst for human blood, especially that of newborns. Like later European vampires, she was associated with the night, bats, owls, and serpents. The Times Zohar Times says, "She roams at night, troubling mortal men, seducing them to defile themselves." The connection between sexuality and corruption became a central theme in vampire narratives. Lilith, as the anti-mother figure, a female entity that draws life force rather than bestowing it. This reversal of maternal instinct runs throughout vampire mythology. When these ancient beliefs intersected with Christianity and Islam, Lilith's influence extended beyond Jewish circles. In Christian demonology, she was linked to the Queen of Hell and the consort of Satan. In medieval art, she occasionally appears as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, handing the forbidden fruit to Eve, directly linking to humanity's original sin. By the Renaissance, Lilith was firmly established in European thought as a symbol of dangerous female desire. Michelangelo painted her into the Sistine Chapel frescoes. In Paradise Lost, John Milton described her as a specter queen who seduces sleeping men. Lilith's connection to blood drinking is most evident in childbirth customs. Among Jews in Europe and the Middle East, amulets to protect infants explicitly warned of Lilith's craving for the blood of newborns. No mother was left alone during the sensitive postpartum period. They would tie red threads around the cradle as a lure. A typical amulet read, "Lilith, stay away from this child. Your domain is the wilderness and darkness." When Bram Stoker created the vampire mythos, his primary sources were Romanian folktales and early literary works. But Lilith's deep cultural memory had already permeated European vampire mythology. Her influence is subtly reflected in Dracula. The three female vampires in the castle are called Dracula's brides, and their function as temptresses resembles Lilith. They attempt to drink Jonathan Harker's blood, charged with erotic tension. There was something about them that made me uneasy, a mixture of longing and deadly fear. A debased, strong desire rose in me to let them kiss me with those deep red lips. Even Lucy Westenra, after becoming a vampire, displays a twisted maternal instinct. She prowls in the darkness, holding an infant while hunting children, a horrible mockery of maternal tenderness. This directly connects to Lilith's tendency to kill children. Carmilla, by Sheridan Le Fanu, appearing 25 years before Dracula and profoundly influencing Stoker, most directly explores the connection between female vampires and motherhood. In this narrative, the vampire Carmilla builds an intense relationship with young protagonist Laura, a girl she both adores and drains. Her feeding is portrayed in starkly maternal language, as Carmilla cradles her victim. Her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper, almost sobbing, "You are mine. You shall be mine, and you and I are one forever." This possessive caregiving twists the mother-child bond. Just as Lilith myths warped expectations of female nurturing, the vampire mother does not bestow life through her body, she consumes it. Lilith's shadow stretches past Dracula into contemporary vampire literature and cinema. Anne Rice's blood-sucking women, especially Akasha in The Queen of the Damned, rely heavily on Lilith archetypes as ancient, mighty feminine beings whose sexuality is both enticing and lethal. Even the movie Vampire's looks owe something to Lilith. Her classic depiction, pale skin, long black hair, red lips, and a supernatural beauty, became the archetype for female vampires on screen, from Theda Bara's silent film vamps to modern versions. The castle where Elizabeth Báthory perpetrated her crimes still stands in Slovakia, drawing visitors fascinated by her bloody legend. Overlooking Lake Geneva, the Villa Diodati commemorates the literary birth of the modern vampire. But Lilith has no concrete monument. Instead, her mark is left on thousands of amulets, ancient scriptures, and the persisting archetype of the lethal maternal figure that continues to haunt our shared imagination. In her revolt against patriarchal dominance, her sexual freedom, and her dreadful thirst, Lilith signifies perhaps the most ancient vampire of all, not a revived corpse or a fictional creation, but a primordial fear of feminine power not restrained by male authority. When Count Dracula snarls, "The blood is the life" in Stoker's book, he reflects a comprehension of blood's sanctity that Lilith personified thousands of years earlier. The vampire's eternal existence via blood drinking reverses natural order, just as Lilith's disobedience upset the intended hierarchy of Eden. In her ancient wings, we may detect the first hint of the bat-like vampires that would later haunt Victorian London and, through Stoker's invention, the entire contemporary world. The Arnold Paulé incident, the Serbian vampire outbreak. While literary vampires were conceived in the passionate imaginations of romantic poets and ancient vampire-like creatures arose from early myths, the modern scientific idea of vampirism, and indeed the word vampire itself in Western tongues, arises from a strange series of events that occurred in early 18th century Serbia. This historical event, known as the Arnold Paulé affair, marks the point when vampire folklore stopped being only local superstition and became a subject of official investigation, recorded in government documents and debated in the scholarly academies across Europe. The year was 1725, and Serbia was then part of the Habsburg monarchy, recently taken from the Ottoman Empire through the Treaty of Passarowitz marked the moment when Austrian authorities began imposing bureaucratic order on newly acquired lands, introducing Enlightenment-era governance to areas deeply rooted in age-old myths and supernatural beliefs. Within the settlement of Medveja, close to Parachin, resided a Hajduk rebel by the name of Arnold Paulé, who had just come back after serving as a soldier in Greek lands. As subsequent accounts reveal, Paulé privately shared with villagers that while stationed in Greece, a vampire had tormented him. Adhering to customary practices, he consumed dirt from the vampire's burial site and coated his body with its blood for safeguarding purposes. Not long after coming home, Pauli tumbled off a hay cart and suffered a broken neck. His burial followed the usual rites of Orthodox Christianity, but mere weeks after his interment, locals started claiming they saw Paule roaming after dark. Shortly thereafter, 4 villagers perished in unexplained ways. Each one, before expiring, insisted that Paule had appeared to them during the night. 40 days following Paule's demise, a crucial span in Orthodox tradition, during which the soul lingers on earth awaiting final judgment, the community dug up his body. Acting in accordance with Serbian vampire lore, they conducted the exhumation. What they uncovered, as later witness statements attest, validated their deepest dread. Paule's corpse displayed no signs of normal decay. New blood seemed to seep from his eyes, nostrils, mouth, and ears. His original fingernails had shed, replaced by new growth. His complexion was flushed and vibrant, unlike the ashen hue of the deceased. Abiding by regional tradition, the villagers impaled Paule's heart with a wooden stake, allegedly making the cadaver groan and release a torrent of blood. Afterward, they cremated the remains, blended the ashes with water, and forced the mixture upon the recently afflicted as a remedy. The 4 individuals who perished following Paule's spectral visits underwent identical procedures, with witnesses claiming they exhibited comparable vampire traits. Had the matter ceased there, it would have been just another isolated bout of vampire panic. However, half a decade later in 1730, a fresh outbreak of fatalities hit Medveja. Over a span of 3 months, 17 residents succumbed to brief sicknesses marked by intense symptoms: chest pain, fatigue, and coughing up blood. Signs now recognizable as tuberculosis, but incomprehensible back then. In their fear, the villagers blamed these deaths on the earlier victims of Arnold Paole, convinced that despite all measures, those victims had themselves turned into vampires. On this occasion, however, the situation reached the ears of Austrian officials. Lieutenant Colonel Schnetzer, who commanded the Jagodina Infantry Regiment, sent regimental field surgeon Johannes Flukinger to examine the events. Flukinger came accompanied by 2 army surgeons, Segoli and Johann Friedrich Baumgarten, thus forming what is likely the first formally authorized vampire investigation committee in history. On the 7th of January, 1731, the medical contingent commenced methodical disinterments at the Medveja graveyard, inspecting 13 corpses in total. Their observations were compiled into an exhaustive document entitled Visum et Repertum, meaning seen and discovered, a report that, upon its printing and dissemination across Europe, would emerge as one of the most pivotal records in vampire lore. The surgeon's detached, clinical language confers a veneer of empirical credibility upon phenomena that might otherwise be brushed aside as rustic folklore. Take, for instance, their examination of the body of Malika, a 9-year-old woman who expired following a 2-month sickness. Upon opening the corpse, they discovered in the thoracic cavity an amount of fresh blood outside the vessels. The pulmonary vessels and the heart's ventricle were not, as is typical, packed with clotted blood, and all internal organs, namely the lungs, liver, stomach, spleen, and intestines, appeared as fresh as those of a living, healthy individual. Out of the 13 cadavers scrutinized, 10 were classified as vampires. Due to their remarkable state of preservation and the existence of fresh blood within the cadavers, the authorities commanded that these bodies be impaled, beheaded, incinerated, and their remains scattered into the Morava River. Thanks to its clinical terminology and the imperial stamp of authority, the Flückiger report elevated vampires from mere folklore to a subject demanding scientific scrutiny, initially released in Vienna, then rendered into French, German, and English. This ignited what modern historians term the vampire controversy, an Enlightenment-era dispute about the potential reality of vampires, and the scientific methods needed to account for the documented occurrences. Would eventually be described as Orientalism, the Western inclination to perceive Eastern societies as exotic, irrational, and menacing. Dracula embodies the East's invasion of the West, turning the colonial dynamic that Britain had forged across vast regions of the globe. The Count's scheme to penetrate London, clearly articulated as his objective from the story's outset, signifies a horrifying reversal of British colonization. In the same way that British traders, missionaries, and armed forces expanded worldwide, Dracula aims to disseminate his undead state across all of Britain. Maybe what sets him apart is his extraordinary flexibility, his talent for personifying the particular anxieties of every age that meets him. During the uneasy period after World War, Dracula emerged in F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, taking the form of a rodent-like being, evoking the pests that carried illness across devastated Europe. In the Cold War era, Hammer Films reinvented him as a figure draped in crimson, an aristocrat whose eroticism defied traditional societal values. Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 version turned him into a sorrowful romantic protagonist for the age of AIDS, his affliction symbolizing an illness passed on through blood and close physical interaction. Even now, in the digital era, Dracula keeps on transforming. Modern retellings have recast him as a business tycoon, a symbol for terrorism, an anti-hero challenging conventional ethics, and even as a pitiable being whose monstrousness mirrors human wickedness rather than otherworldly malevolence. Every fresh version incorporates aspects of current unease while retaining the core traits that instantly identify the Count. Such adaptability indicates that Dracula's real beginnings are not rooted in any one historical person or folklore, but in something deeper within humanity, our timeless obsession with mortality, and our urgent yearning to overcome it. The vampire embodies both our deepest dread, death and deterioration, and our ultimate wish, everlasting life and youth, blended into one captivating entity. The blood is the life, Dracula proclaims in Stoker's book, mirroring scriptural phrasing, but twisting its sacred significance. This conversion of holy into unholy, of life-bestowing into life-stealing, exposes the fundamental violation at the core of the vampire legend. Dracula grants eternal life without heavenly approval, continuous existence without everlasting redemption, infinite longing without the chance of satiety. The Dracula's castle that Stoker envisioned in the Carpathian Mountains was never real, yet visitors still travel to Romania searching for the genuine castle of Dracula. The vampire outbreak that Austrian authorities recorded in 18th century Serbia has been accounted for by contemporary medicine, but the accounts still disturb readers with their medical depictions of uncorrupted bodies. The real Vlad Tepes never consumed blood, yet his name is still linked to vampirism. This blending of truth and fantasy, actual events and folklore, uncovers the genuine strength of the Dracula myth. He dwells in the twilight zones separating classes, not completely living nor absolutely deceased, not wholly imagined nor fully grounded in history, not alien nor known, yet somehow both at once. As we conclude our investigation into Dracula's beginnings, we must admit that the ultimate wellspring of his strength resides not in old Transylvania or Victorian-era London, but within our own minds. The Count persists because he touches something timeless within human existence: our captivation with death, our mixed feelings about sex, our dread of the unfamiliar, and our hidden longing to breach the boundaries that outline human life. We learn from failure, not from success, Van Helsing remarks in Stoker's story. Maybe that's why Dracula stayed so fascinating despite his eventual downfall. He fails in his attack on London, is forced back to his homeland, and is vanquished. But within that defeat rests his eternal life, not the actual unending existence he desired, but the cultural perpetuity that has maintained his undead presence in our minds for decades. If you've appreciated this deep dive into Dracula's roots, subscribe to Obsidian Vault's investigations into Gothic writing and shadowy history. Tell us in the comments which version of the Count's beginnings captivated you most. Was it the real brutality of Vlad Tepes, the blood fixation of Elizabeth Báthory, or the ancient power of Lilith? Or perhaps the Victorian dread that molded these elements into the vampire we know today? When we next meet in the darkness where history and terror merge, remember that the most enduring monsters do not emerge from distant Transylvanian fortresses, but from the deepest shadows of our collective cultural consciousness. Dracula endures because we still fear death, crave eternal life, and believe that somewhere in the night, primal evils still thirst for the blood of the living. Sleep peacefully, dear audience. And if you feel a cold breath on your neck in the darkest hour before dawn, remember that immortality always demands a price. Not all legends are content to remain safely imprisoned within the pages of dusty volumes.